Intermittent fasting, the pros and cons, my journey. All right, folks, let's get right into it today. Intermittent fasting. You know, when I'm picking topics for the show, I usually go through a couple of things in my mind. Obviously, what are people interested to know more about? Have any of you guys mentioned something to me in the comments or a message you want to hear about? And lastly, it's kind of how much experience do I have in the topic at hand? A lot of it is me doing research. A lot of it is me leaning on some of the doctors and experts that I trust. And then a lot of it is my own journey anecdotally. How much can I bring to it as well? Great example. I can talk a lot more about fat loss anecdotally than, say, Olympic weightlifting because I was heavy growing up and I struggled with being overweight like a lot of people. And since then, I have lost a lot of weight, a lot of fat. I've put on some muscle at the same time, and I've kept it off for many, many years. So that's part of the reason that today's topic is so interesting. We're going to talk intermittent fasting. I'm going to give you guys the rundown on what it is, how it works, how you might apply it to your life or not. And I'm going to share with you guys my experiences with it as well. I actually was intermittent fasting on and off for years. And spoiler alert, I no longer intermittent fast. Does that mean you should or shouldn't? Well, not necessarily, but we're going to talk about it. So this is going to be a lot of fun. Intermittent fasting. We hear a lot about it today in the media. Health gurus, actual gurus, not dudes like me. Got a man bun and a microphone. I've been working hard on those man buns this week, Al. A lot of glute work. But here's the caffeinated what. This is what we always start with. What actually is intermittent fasting? It's when you limit the periods of time during the day when you can eat or consume calories. The rest of the time during the day, you're simply not eating. Intermittent fasting, we have what is called a feeding window. So for example, if I'm doing a 16-8 intermittent feeding schedule, which is what I was doing when I did this years ago. It's a popular one. For 8 hours a day, I'm allowing myself to consume food. For the other 16 hours a day, I am simply not. What other types of intermittent fasting do people do? The 16-18 split is most popular. Some people do 18-6 splits. I've even seen 24 splits. Just basically variations of the size of the feeding window versus the time you're fasting. People will even fast for days at a time depending on their preferences. So what is really interesting about this already? Well, you're already intermittent fasting. What? What do you mean? No, I'm not. Yeah, you are. You're probably doing the reverse right now of the 16-8 we're talking about. Instead of a 16-8 schedule, you might be doing more of an 8-16 schedule where you guessed it, you're eating over the course of 16 hours a day, or the time you're pretty much awake, and those other 8 hours you're not consuming any calories because you're sleeping. You fast through the night, every night. So to some degree, again, you're doing this already. And if you're not doing that, and you have like a burrito and some Frank's Red Hot in bed with you or something like that, you have problems I simply cannot help you with. Don't feel bad, I have problems I can't help me with either. So you're already doing a form of fasting when you sleep. The question is, are you fasting long enough to have an impact, or are you fasting long enough to have the impact intermittent fasting aims to, or in some ways claims to have? We're going to take a look. Some of our research today is going to come from Johns Hopkins, references as always in the show notes. There's a neuroscientist, Mark Mattson, who studied intermittent fasting for 25 years. He's going to pull the paleo card. It's evolution, baby! And frankly, he may not be wrong. He says we evolved from a period where we've gone long periods of time without food, and that was commonplace. This is true. This is absolutely true. And it also makes sense. It took a lot more energy for hunters and gatherers to obtain food. They likely weren't eating while they were, expelling those calories to find the food itself. There were very few supermarkets in the Flintstones. This is also true. Is that true though? Did the Flintstones have supermarkets? I don't remember. I really hope this episode doesn't get fact checked. That would be embarrassing. So they were running after gazelle or fighting a tiger for their life, or perhaps just gathering berries. Not on their segways, they were walking. So much of the logic they're trying to apply is, and I don't just mean Mark at Johns Hopkins, I mean the whole intermittent fasting community, or a big portion of the people who believe in it is, so much focus then was about actually obtaining the food. They simply couldn't be sitting around eating it all day. I see. I can certainly see how this line of thought comes into play today with our own lifestyles. A lot of damage going on there, and an enormous amount of that damage, I believe, will get much worse for our youngest generation if they don't start combating it from an early age, or if their parents aren't aware of it. We eat terrible foods, much of them often fast, in ways we don't even accept for our dogs and cats. We drive everywhere, and because of that, we've become enormously sedentary. Much of us work desk jobs, we're sitting, the other silent killer lurks, and as much as I think technology is incredible, I also realize the impact it's having on our health. And for you guys watching this who care, who are trying to make healthy changes and choices, that's amazing. This is only a tool. But for the kids, or even frankly adults who are glued to the TVs, this is a recipe for disaster. See what I did there? Nutrition, recipe. What I'm getting at is, since people aren't moving as much as they were even 20 or 30 years ago, let alone 12,000 plus years ago, intermittent fasting aims to at least change the feeding window to conform to something that we've evolved from and is perceived to be more healthy. The people supporting fasting believe once your body stops having food for fuel, as in after your 8-hour feeding window has closed, in the next 16 hours, your body will have to use fat for fuel. Maybe, maybe not. This is where I begin to disagree a little bit, and science doesn't always support this. I think it's important we make a distinction here. And this is part of the reason I think intermittent fasting could be great for some people and not so great for others, like myself. You can eat an enormous amount of calories in 8 hours, or even 6 hours, or even 4 hours, especially if you haven't eaten for 16 to 20 hours. There is no magical diet that's going to override the laws of thermogenesis, at least not that I'm aware of. And I could be wrong, but I'm pretty confident in this one. So, if you're eating in a caloric deficit in those 8 hours, or however long your feeding window is, and then you fast the other 16 hours, will you lose fat? Absolutely, you will. Could it make it easier for you to eat less by having times you eat and times you stop, like hard and fast rules? Well, I don't know. I guess it could. It's really up to you and your preference. But it is not the fasting itself that is causing you to lose the fat. There is no mechanism there that's making fat fall off you. It's the deficit. If I could eat like an animal all day for 8 hours a day and then fast for 16 and lose fat, I would still be intermittent fasting today. That's not the reality of it. The other thing we should probably keep in mind with fasting as well is we have enormous stimulus around us today to eat very quick, calorically dense foods and very addictive foods as well. Believe it or not, the same evolution that intermittent fasting in some ways is kind of based on, or their argument of why it can work well is, that evolution causes us to crave those not so healthy foods. Food was not always available, and the more likely a food was to put fat on us, the more likely we were to survive. So we're programmed to want to consume as much of those fatty, sugary, not so good for us foods as we can. Also, another important side note here, our ancestors had no choice in their feeding schedules. We're also trying to apply a rational choice to something that was, again, just a matter of survival. Who knows? If they could have bags of M&Ms on them or beef jerky and protein bars like while they were chasing after gazelle, maybe they would have. I imagine they would have. Why would they not want to eat? But they couldn't. So again, it's a matter of survival. This is the same way we choose to go to a gym to exercise. We choose to go for a jog to exercise or kickbox, whatever. There was no exercise then. Exercise wasn't something you decided to do. It was survival. Does that mean intermittent fasting is without benefit today? Not necessarily. I think that's going to come down to you as an individual. But let's talk weight loss. What does the science say? A 2023 study in the Journal of the American Heart Association showed intermittent fasting did not have a positive correlation with weight loss, meaning the more meals people ate over the course of the day, the more likely they were to lose weight or have a lower weight. Well, why is this? There's always variables in these studies, but I think, and again, I am not a doctor or a scientist or a master of controlled environments, but I think it comes down to Dracula's favorite nutritive sweetener, blood sugar. One corny joke. Well, at least this insatiation. There are a lot of reasons I think people do better eating throughout the day, but having more stable blood sugar levels is certainly one of them. And also not having periods of time where you're excessively hungry is probably another thing that would help a whole lot. We talk a lot about protein on this show too. And no doubt, those 16 hours you aren't eating the protein when you're fasting. You're not only potentially hurting muscle protein synthesis, potentially, you also are not eating something satiating that's going to help get you to the next meal that much easier. Lastly, I also think a lot of people that are intermittent fasting are not able to train, meaning weight train, around the times when they are eating for whatever reason. For example, if I'm doing the 16-8 split and I go to work, let's say at 8:30 in the morning, and I train before work, let's say 7 in the morning. For me to have nutrition in me for my workout, I would have had to have a pre-workout meal at least 6 a.m. or so for it to have an effect on my training, me personally. Yeah, I could have had a banana or something sugary a little closer to the workout, but for me, this helps me the most. So that means from 6 a.m. when I have my pre-workout meal all the way to 2 p.m. I can eat. That makes it very hard to come home from work and eat dinner with my family. It's like you could be 25 years old and already committing to a life of the early bird special. For obvious reasons, these people may be training fasted, like I did for years, and not eating until long after their workouts. There is no doubt this can impact their training, their muscle growth, which of course ties into fat loss big time. Lane Norden also put out a video a few weeks ago, shout out to Lane, I love your stuff, where he reviews a randomized control trial, which just kind of further reinforced this. The study actually looks at calories and macronutrients, not just feeding windows, and also found there was no difference in weight loss in intermittent fasting. There was even a slight advantage to the people eating normally regarding fat loss. There was also a decline in physical activity in people with intermittent fasting. This doesn't surprise me very much. If you don't have a steady supply of energy, you might not be as active depending on when your feeding window is. If I'm doing more earlier in the day, but my feeding window is later at night when I might not be as active because that's when I'm with my family, i.e. eating dinner, I could see being less active over the course of the day because of that. I will get you a link to Dr. Norton's channel. He's terrific. Check him out. Now, I'm mostly talking about fat loss here today because that's a big part of this show. But are there other health benefits and or risks associated with intermittent fasting? Well, now it gets a little tricky. It's been said by some that there are cardiovascular benefits to intermittent fasting and even specific benefits to people with type 2 diabetes. Well, as of the time of me recording this, ironically, there was a study from just a few months ago claiming a 91%. That's a really big percent. That's like if I have a 91% chance of hitting the lotto, I am buying tickets all day. A 91% higher risk of death from cardiovascular disease when you're intermittent fasting, and basically there was no longevity benefit whatsoever to it. Per Dr. Norden as well, who I love hearing his reviews and his research, the study hasn't been released yet, the full study. This was just the abstract, and the full peer review takes like 6 to 12 months to get. The only thing that I can make any sense out of is if people are just eating whatever they want during their feeding windows for whatever reason, and their BMIs go up, like we talk about a lot here, they're gaining weight from the intermittent fasting. I can see it absolutely having an adverse effect on health for that reason, for sure. But that's not necessarily just an intermittent fasting issue. Anytime your BMI goes up to an unhealthy place, you're going to have problems. That all being said, I'm not a doctor. I certainly do not have the expertise of Dr. Norden, but I do have my experiences with intermittent fasting. I started intermittent fasting to try and eat less. I tried to do this as part of a fat loss phase or several, where the idea was if I was only eating during certain times, this would keep me from overeating at night. And at the time, that was where most of the trouble I was having with my diet was. The eating I was doing right before bed. I had a little success with it, but honestly for me, it was always a battle of willpower, stopping eating at that time. And the problem was the following morning or afternoon when I could eat again, I had been fasted so long I was starving, I was ravenous. This could definitely be what was going on with the people in the study. They were starving, they ate way too much during their feeding windows. Also remember, I don't know what the people in the study were doing, but I was heavy weight training, and like I alluded to, I was training in the morning before my eating window even started. I was training before work. So this turned my training sessions into absolute garbage. The two biggest reasons I stopped intermittent fasting was by eating regularly throughout the day. It reduced my cravings a ton as my blood sugar was more stable. And once I started incorporating terrific pre and post workout meals, my training went through the roof. The difference was incredible. I had probably missed out on a few years of optimal training. Hindsight is always 20/20, right? So does that mean I'm against intermittent fasting? Well, for me, I am. It didn't work for me. If there's a strong correlation between fasting and heart disease, I obviously wouldn't recommend that either to you, but I'm not sold on that. I think people who were fasting, it kind of gave them the opposite effect that they were looking for. They ended up eating more, they got fatter, their BMI went up, and they had health problems because of it. I'm not sold that the fasting did it. So, as I've said many times before, flex dieting works wonders for me. I've tried a host of different diet plans, and this is clearly my favorite. I'm gonna do a deep dive on it in the future so you can see how I approach it. I don't feel restricted by it at all. I sincerely love doing it. I'm not necessarily against any diet for you because, hey, to each their own. And if intermittent fasting allows you to eat in a caloric deficit for longer and you feel better and your training isn't affected and you enjoy it, more power to you. That is awesome. The best diet for you is the one that works best for you. But you might also want to be aware of any other studies that come out in the future kind of regarding the dangers of it. I don't know if one is enough, but where there's smoke, there's fire, and if you start hearing a lot of it, you might want to look into it. However you choose to eat, though, there is one thing I will suggest, be it intermittent fasting or whatever else you want to try. See where you're at like in 6 months after you start, or a year after you start, before you form a solid opinion as of the effectiveness of this. The reason is there is a honeymoon phase for sure when you start doing something new, and a lot of these diet strategies are great in the short term until life and life changes get in the way, where if it's not a natural thing to you and it's taking so much effort to do, which initially when you start, you're raring, you're excited. Once that effort goes away, it can be a problem. For example, low carb diets can be great until you're having Uncle Tito's birthday this year at the Olive Garden. And now you can't stop eating the breadsticks because if the delicious taste wasn't enough, they're also treating you like family. And that's priceless. That's priceless, Al. Happy birthday, Uncle Tito. We love you. All right, that's intermittent fasting for you folks. Let me know in the comments. Do you use intermittent fasting? Are you angry at me for what I had to say about it? Have you used it in the past? What are your experiences? I want to hear from you guys, as always.